Hello, everybody. This is the one new lecture for this week. We'll be starting the kidney and urinary system. As a general concept, the kidney, let's see if I can get this to actually do what it's supposed to do. There we go. The kidneys constantly filter your blood. 20% of your cardiac output goes to the kidneys for filtration, then goes back and gets pumped out to the body. So it's a very continuous process. It's one reason why dialysis is really difficult, because people will go in for a few hours a couple of times a week, but in between times their blood isn't being filtered. So the toxins are constantly building up. And think about if you wanted to sort a drawer in the kitchen. There's a couple of ways you could do it. You can open the drawer and take out one thing and take out one thing. Or you could dump it out on the counter and then put back the things that you want. That would be a quick, kind of a really efficient way. And that's sort of the way your kidneys do it. Of the blood that goes through the kidney, like I say, 20% of your cardiac output goes to the kidney every time your heart beats. And of that blood that goes to the kidney, about 20% of that plasma gets filtered out as it goes through and becomes your primary urine. And that primary urine takes along with it everything except your red blood cells and the really large plasma proteins who are supposed to stay in there to keep your osmotic pressure up. But all of your electrolytes and your glucose and all of the other stuff just filters right in there with the plasma. So it's like dumping the kitchen, drawer on the counter. And then the blood goes back by some little tubules, and you take back what you want. And then you pee out the rest. So that's how you do it. You take back the things your body needs, and the things you don't need, you pee out, you excrete. So everything pretty much goes in there except not the red blood cells and not the large albumin type plasma proteins. The kidneys do a number of things. They regulate your water volume, blood volume, and therefore your blood pressure to a great degree. The osmolarity of your blood, the total solute in your blood, because as the blood goes through, you can pee out some of that stuff if you have too much of it. You can retain more if you don't have enough. If your blood is too thick, you can retain more water to thin it out. If it's too thin, you can pee out more water to make it more concentrated. So you're controlling your fluid levels and the concentration of the solutes that are in there. Ion concentrations, your sodium, potassium, calcium, bicarbonate, your various ions, chloride, are related because you either retain or pee them out. Acid-base balance, extremely important to keep very close to 7.4. We'll have, one of our third lecture has quite a bit of acid-base balance in it. But you can either retain or pee out hydrogen ions, which is acid. And you can retain or pee out bicarbonate ions, which are base. And so controlling your acid-base balance. And you remove all sorts of metabolic wastes, toxins, things your body makes that you have no reason to keep, and so you pee them out. And drugs. If you take penicillin, in a certain amount of time, it gets cleared out of your bloodstream. So both good and bad drugs get cleared by the kidneys. You also have some endocrine functions, which we have talked about in previous sections. If your blood pressure is low, you make more renin. Your kidneys detect the low blood pressure, you make renin. Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. The aldosterone causes your kidneys to retain more of sodium and therefore retain more water and make your blood pressure go up. And if your blood pressure is too high, you make less of it. So renin is produced as a hormone by the kidneys to regulate your blood pressure. If your oxygen levels are too low, your kidneys detect that you make more erythropoietin, it goes to your bone marrow, and you make more red blood cells. We discussed that previously too. Vitamin D is made in your skin. It's stimulated by sunlight. And vitamin D has to be activated by the kidneys so that it can then go to your intestines and turn on the calcium channels, which bring calcium from your food into your body. So you have to activate your vitamin D at the kidneys so you can use your calcium transporters to bring calcium in and increase your calcium levels. They also can perform gluconeogenesis when you get really needy of having more carbohydrate in your blood. The liver is the primary creator of glucose, but gluconeogenesis can take place in the kidneys as well. The parts of the urinary system are the kidneys themselves that do the filtration, 2 of them. From those you have tubes going down, 1 each, ureters. They go down to the urinary bladder, which stores the urine temporarily. Remember, the urinary bladder, like the stomach, uses receptive relaxation. When the urine starts filling up the bladder, it relaxes and reforms its pressure around that new volume so that you can store quite a bit of urine before you have to pee. And then the urethra will transport the urine from the body to the outside. So here we have them. Here's your kidneys. Renal is the term. So renal failure means kidney failure. Nephro is another term for kidneys. So nephritis will mean inflammation of the kidney as well. We're going to call them kidneys mostly, but the terms like renal artery, the renal hilum, the renal vein, that means kidney. Adrenal glands, your adrenal glands on top, we know where they are, and remember they make aldosterone in response to renin-angiotensin aldosterone. Aldosterone will work directly in the kidney to help you retain water and sodium. You're rounded on the back here. You have a little dimple, a belly button in the middle here called the renal hilum. The hilum is the area where all your tubes go in and out. Your arteries, your veins, and your ureter all come out of the renal hilum. The location of the kidneys is described as retroperitoneal. Your peritoneum is the bag that holds all of your guts in. So your intestines and your stomach and your pancreas and stuff are within the peritoneum. But the kidneys are not. They're behind the peritoneum, between that bag and the back of your abdominal wall. And so they're retroperitoneal. They're also far enough down that they're only protected really by the floating ribs. So kidneys are pretty easy to damage by a blow from the rear. The renal hilum leads into the renal sinus, which is the area inside the kidney where all of the pee collects. The ureters, renal blood vessels, lymphatics, and the nerves for the kidney all come out of the renal hilum. So here are the kidneys right in front of the floating ribs. The right one is a little bit down because the liver is so big over here, it actually just translocates the kidney slightly downward. And there are the ureters coming out of the kidneys. Here is looking down from here. Here's the peritoneum, this bag here that holds your intestines and stuff, and the kidneys are behind that. So are the ureters, and so is the bladder is below it. So the whole urinary system is outside of the peritoneum. Here's a kidney. We have the renal artery coming in. We have the renal vein going out. We have the ureter coming out to take the urine that has been produced by the kidney. The outside of the kidney here is called the cortex, like your brain, your cerebral cortex. The cortex of the kidney is on the outside. The renal medulla is made up of pyramids. These are called renal pyramids, and all the pyramids together make up the renal medulla. You have, at the end of each renal medulla, you have what's called a papilla. The papilla is the little spigot where all of the urine that's been made up in here comes out, and it's caught in a little funnel-shaped thing called a calyx, or calyces is the plural for them. We'll spend more time with the anatomy in lab, but here you have the cortex, the medulla made up of these pyramids with papilla on the end, dumping urine into a renal calyx, which all then gathers together in the renal sinus. The pelvis is this whole area in here between this part and this part of the kidney, so it's a little hard to tell it from the sinus. You know, the renal pelvis, the renal sinus. The renal sinus, though, is the where all of the liquid ultimately gathers. Remember the renal sinus, the coronary sinus in our cardiovascular section, where everything that gathers together then dumps into the final tube. In this case, your final tube is the ureter. So the renal pelvis, renal sinus, I won't put both of those on the same lab list because it's hard to say. This is pointing there. That's not actually the renal sinus. The renal sinus is inside here. The renal pelvis is the area. The renal sinus is the catchment. The ureter is the outflow tube. Then within the cortex and the medulla are these little structures called nephrons. And that's where the business happens. These are the actual filtering systems that will then all dump out of the papilla into the calyx, into the renal pelvis / sinus. Blood vessels. The renal artery comes in, the renal vein goes out. The renal artery breaks down into interlobar arteries and veins. Now, your book and mine calls these way out here interlobar arteries also. They're like a projection of it, but that's not what I would prefer to call them. The interlobar arteries and veins are these bigger guys going out into the lobes. These are going to be your arterioles out here that are going to actually supply blood to the nephrons. When you get to the end of an interlobar artery, you have these arch-shaped arteries, and those are called arcuate arteries. Arcuate arteries. And off of the arcuate arteries come these arterioles that are going to supply the nephrons. So here's the nephron, and you have the arcuate artery sending out here, and then you have the, once again, they still like to call this interlobar artery, but that's, to me, the bigger guy here. Off of the arcuate artery come these arterioles that will control the amount of blood flow that goes into the nephron. This is an entire nephron system here. And what you have is an arteriole coming in that controls how much blood goes into the nephron. And then you have an efferent arteriole that goes out. Afferent in, efferent out. A comes before E. Both of these will help control the amount of blood in here and the pressure in there, which will help determine how much plasma filters out of this. This ball of capillaries in here is called the glomerulus. Your glomerular filtration rate is a number that you'll have to learn to use. That means how much plasma you're actually filtering out of these capillaries throughout your entire kidney. This ball of capillaries is the glomerulus, or the glomerular capillaries. It's inside something called Bowman's capsule. Or it may be that your book just calls it the nephron capsule or renal capsule or something like that. But Bowman's capsule is a very common name for this. And this is a hollow basketball around this ball of capillaries. So when they leak fluid out, it gets caught in here and steered into the tubules where all of the business happens. So we're filtering out of here. It goes into the proximal tubule, which means it comes first. They will, in the book, call it the proximal convoluted tubule because it's all bendy, and then the proximal straight tubule. To me, it will work if you just know there's a proximal tubule and a distal tubule. The proximal is before you get to the loops here, and the distal is afterward. After the proximal tubule, you have the descending loop of Henle, the ascending loop of Henle. Then you have the distal tubule, straight and convoluted. But in each of these areas has a little bit of a different job to do. That's why they have different names. But the proximal tubule does enough similar stuff that works for me. The descending limb does one thing, the ascending loop does another, the distal tubule does something else. And then it will dump that urine into this collecting duct, the collecting duct, which is collecting urine from a bunch of nephrons. See, here's one coming in, there's one coming in, there's one coming in, and this one is coming in from this guy. So the collecting duct is collecting urine from a bunch of nephrons, but it will also process that urine quite a bit itself. Okay, so what we have to do, first, when the blood comes into that glomerular ball, we have to filter fluid out. Then it has to go through the tubes, and you have to reabsorb a bunch of stuff. It's like any set of capillaries in the body. Remember, you filter first, and then you reabsorb later, so that in between times, things can happen to the blood. So the filtration takes place in the glomerulus. That filtration of anything means it's leaving the blood. Reabsorption means it's coming back into the blood. So it leaves the blood, comes back into the blood. You're filtering fluid and also whatever solute is in that fluid. You reabsorb fluid and whatever solute you want to reabsorb. And if there's anything else you want to get rid of even more than the filtration will take care of, you can secrete some more so you can pee it out. So you filter stuff, you secrete some more, then you reabsorb everything you want to keep, and then you pee out the rest. Peeing is, the stuff that leaves your body is excreted, not secreted. Secretion just means it's moving from the blood into the urine, but that doesn't mean it can't be reabsorbed. If it comes out in your pee, you have excreted it. Excreted food comes out in the feces. Blood is sweat is excreted when it leaves your body and drips off your arm. Okay, so excretion and secretion are not the same. Don't get them mixed up on the test. Secretion is you're just actively getting rid of something and moving it into the urine, and it may stay there or not. But what gets excreted is what actually does leave the body. So, what is excreted equals how much you filtered and secreted minus how much of it you reabsorbed. Everything else winds up in the urine. So here we go, diagrammatically. Here we have the afferent arteriole. It's bringing blood into Bowman's capsule, into the glomerulus. You will filter the fluid containing the solute. Then that blood will go down here and come back and start taking in the things that it wants before it returns to your body. This initial urine that is produced, the primary filtrate it's called, is your initial urine, but you can secrete more stuff into it if you want to get it out of the blood and get rid of it. You can reabsorb whatever you want to keep, and then whatever leaves is excreted. So filtration and secretion minus reabsorption will then determine how much you pee out. Here's 3 examples of processes, and we have everything in between. Here we have a substance that we want to completely get rid of. It's a metabolic waste product. There's no reason to keep it because we're always making more. So when it goes through here, you filter out whatever amount filters out with your plasma, just a mechanical process. Then the blood goes around here. It comes next to the tubule, and you secrete the rest of it into the urine. So all of it gets excreted. You excrete all of it. 0 is winding up in your blood. Now here's a common scenario where you filter the normal amount in there. You suck back a little bit more because you've determined that you need a little bit more of that, and then you pee out whatever's left over. Most of it stays in your blood, some of it gets peed out, and that way you balance it out in your blood. This is like sodium. You don't want to pee out all your sodium. You want to keep most of it, but you pee out enough to keep everything in balance because you eat a lot of it. So this is a good way to control. So you have quite a bit in the blood and a little bit coming out in the urine. It's like sodium. Here, the blood comes in and you filter the normal amount, but you don't want to lose any of it. Glucose, amino acids, nutrients. You don't want to lose nutrients. So whatever you filter, you have transporters and you reabsorb it all, so it all stays in the blood and none is excreted in the urine. Glucose is a great example of that. When you have diabetes and you have so much glucose in here you can't reabsorb it all, it starts showing up in your pee. And it's a sign that you have diabetes. So what you're trying to do is reabsorb all of that particular substance. Now, how easily it gets filtered depends on how big it is, mostly. Water always moves wherever it wants, so it has a number of 1. Perfect filtration. And sodium goes right along with it, so it gets the same perfect number. So does glucose. Anything that moves at exactly the same concentration it already was in the blood is called freely filtered. And actually, most of your stuff is freely filtered. 20% of your plasma goes in there, 20% of the stuff goes right along with it in the same concentrations. So freely filtered, small molecules, water. Larger molecules, small proteins, don't freely filter, but they still filter some, and so you're going to have to reabsorb them because you don't want to get rid of them. Red blood cells don't filter at all, unless you have kidney disease, in which case some blood may show up in your urine, which it's not supposed to. And you're not supposed to have a lot of these big albumin plasma proteins. They're supposed to stay in your blood. So as you can see, only 5/1000ths as easily filtered as the freely filtered stuff. So you can pretty much say that everything is more or less freely filtered except for large proteins and red blood cells. So here we have a closer look at the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. Here we have the afferent arterial. Blood is coming in, arcuate arteries over here somewhere, afferent arterial, afferent comes in, efferent goes out, A before E. Okay, so the afferent arterial brings in blood into the glomerular capillaries or glomerulus, which is all inside this Bowman's capsule. Okay, so and these are muscular just like any other arteriole. They can decrease or increase the amount of blood flow through here depending on how much pee you need to make. Then the filtration occurs inside these, from these capillaries into here. This becomes your primary filtrate or your initial urine. And it is steered right down that proximal tubule and into the rest of the nephron. Your filtration forces are the same as they were in every other capillary. You have hydrostatic pressure that pushes, and you have osmotic pressures that pull. If the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary is higher than the oncotic pressures, you filter stuff. If the oncotic pressures are higher than the hydrostatic pressures, you reabsorb, the same as we had in our other capillary systems. And what you want to do is filter first and then reabsorb later, the same as we did before. So in the glomerulus, you have real high blood pressure but low oncotic pressures. And then when you get down to the peritubular capillaries, those capillaries that are around the tubes to take stuff back up, the blood pressure has dropped because you lost a lot of plasma, and the oncotic pressures have increased because the blood is now more concentrated. So here the high pressure wins and you filter. Here the high pulling pressures win and you reabsorb. So here it is. Remember our capillary pressures at like in the leg were 32 at the arterial end and 15 at the other end. Well, here we start out at like 60. Remember, our renal arteries are big arteries coming right off that abdominal aorta. The blood pressure is still pretty darn high. So the hydrostatic pressures are real high. It allows you to filter a whole lot of fluid. Then the pressure is dropped because you lost some of the blood. So you come down here, the blood pressure is low. The osmotic pressures are high because you just concentrated the plasma proteins that didn't go in. So now it's a more concentrated blood with lower hydrostatic pressures, and so it pulls the fluid back in. You filter here, you reabsorb there. That's the way it's supposed to work. By the way, these peritubular capillaries, you know, the peritubular, that just means around the tubule. So it's either in the glomerulus or it is peritubular. It's around the tubules where you can reabsorb. So your glomerular filtration rate is the total amount of primary urine that your glomeruli are making. A healthy kidney produces a lot of initial pee. You reabsorb most of it, but you're filtering quite a lot of fluid, about 125 milliliters per minute in a healthy young kidney, or about a liter every 8 minutes. Can you imagine how much you'd have to pee if every 8 minutes you had a liter of pee to pee? So obviously you reabsorb most of it because you might only have to pee a couple of times a day. So glomerular filtration rate, all your glomeruli put together are producing about 125 mLs per minute. And this glomerular filtration rate can be measured, and it's a really good indicator of how well your kidneys are working. Kind of like cardiac output tells you how well your heart is working. When somebody gets so sick that their glomerular filtration rate drops down too much, it is life-threatening. If their blood pressure is so low that they can't make pee, their blood becomes toxic really quickly, and they die from it, unless they immediately go on dialysis. Now, another term, kind of like, ejection fraction in the heart, this is filtration fraction. It's the percentage of plasma that gets filtered out of whatever plasma goes through the kidney. Under normal conditions at rest, about 20% of the plasma that enters the kidney through the blood system winds up becoming primary pee. So about 20% of your plasma liquid is your filtration fraction. 20% is your filtration fraction. So it's your GFR divided by your plasma flow, renal plasma flow, glomerular filtration rate. So the small number divided by the big one, this is the total plasma, and this is how much gets filtered. Small number divided by big one gives you the fraction. It's not in red. I'm not going to have you calculate that. You just kind of need to know what it is. Changes in the pressures, especially on, well, oncotic pressures or blood pressures, can change this percentage. If your hydrostatic pressure goes up a whole lot, you'll filter more. High blood pressure makes you filter too much, and you get edema and your ankles swell up and all. I mean, you have too much filtration if the blood pressure is too high. So controlling the pressure by the afferent and efferent arterioles will help determine how much of this plasma, the percentage, gets filtered out, and ultimately then how much pee you make. If you increase the pressure inside the glomerulus, you filter more. You increase GFR because you're filtering more overall, and you're increasing the fraction because you're filtering a greater amount of the plasma that's available to filter. You control this, so you always, in a healthy person, are filtering the right amount. You're making the right amount of pee. You're retaining the right amount of water to keep your blood pressure what it's supposed to be. And so you do this by dilating or constricting the afferent arterioles primarily, and also the efferent arteriole, which determines how easy it is for the blood to leave the glomerulus. So the pressure coming in is, and the flow coming in is controlled, and the flow going out is controlled. And so here we have, if it's normal, if everything is normal, you have blood coming in, you get a normal amount of filtration, and then it goes out. Now, if I squeeze the afferent arteriole, I'm going to decrease everything. There's less blood going in, the pressure drops. If you close off the incoming blood flow, the filtration fraction will drop, the GFR will drop, the plasma flow will drop. Everything is less if you don't let as much go in there. If I squeeze the efferent arteriole, the pressure goes up because you're still ramming all this blood in there, but it's making it hard to get out. So efferent arteriole constriction generally increases the pressure in there and therefore increases filtration fraction. Afferent arteriole decreases everything. Blood flow, filtration fraction, GFR, there's less blood, there's less pressure, there's less everything. But if you squeeze only the outflow one, you increase the filtration fraction because the pressure is going up. And then, if you squeeze both of them equally, the amount of the GFR will go down because there's less blood, but the pressure stays about the same because you have a smaller amount coming in, but you also are allowing that same amount to leave, and therefore the only thing that's going to change here is GFR. Kidneys auto-regulate very well. And by the way, I removed a couple of slides out of this lecture that I thought were probably going to confuse you more than they helped. So if I come across a slide and you see it on your computer and it's not there, or there's a slide there that's not here, it's because I removed a couple. If you're using the most current version, though, that's on your in Canvas, it should be this same version. Okay, so GFR remains constant even when the blood pressure more than doubles. When you exercise, your blood pressure in the aorta goes up. Your mean arterial pressure goes way up. The pressure going into those glomeruli goes up, could go up because of all this extra blood. But they immediately sense that and constrict that afferent arteriole so they don't get the extra pressure. You don't want to make more pee while you're running. It doesn't help. You'll become dehydrated. and overwhelm your kidneys. So as you start to exercise, you immediately squeeze those afferent arterioles, and that extra blood can go into your legs where you need it, instead of going through the kidneys where you don't need it. And the way the kidneys regulate this is by something called tubuloglomerular feedback. In other words, the pee that has gone through the tube comes back to the glomerulus and tells you what's up. The pee just went through the tube. It filtered this much, it absorbed this much, here's the pressure, here's the concentration. It comes back right next to the glomerulus and tells the glomerulus to either constrict or dilate its arterioles to compensate for whatever has just happened. It's a really neat system. And the system is a clump of cells called the macula densa. It means a dense plaque. It's a clump of cells, a little bit darker, on the walls of the ascending limb. So that means after it's already gone down the descending limb, it's gone down the ascending limb, it's coming up here, and it comes right by the glomerulus, right where it started. And you have a clump of cells there that have a bunch of sensors in them. They're pressure sensors, they're oxygen sensors, they are sodium concentration sensors. They sense everything. And if the urine is not being processed properly, they either stimulate vasoconstrictors or vasodilators to increase or decrease the amount of fluid going through the kidneys. So it responds to the hemodynamics, the blood dynamics, and the fluid dynamics of the urine and all that, and it secretes the substances that can vasoconstrict or vasodilate. Here's 2 nephrons, so it's showing it twice. But here we have the glomerulus, here we have the proximal tubule, the descending limb, the ascending limb. Right at the end of that ascending limb, before the distal tubule starts, you have this macula densa right next to the glomerulus, right next to the glomerular arterioles, and it will cause a secretion of constrictors and dilators to control how much blood then goes into the next round. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It means close to the glomerulus. The JG, or juxtaglomerular, just means close to the glomerulus. That's where the macula densa is located. And here's another one up here with this nephron. All right, the next general concept is clearance. Remember I said that one thing your kidney does is get rid of stuff you don't want. So to clear it means to get it out of your blood. If I take penicillin, within 6 hours I have cleared so much of it that I have to take another tablet. If I take doxycycline or something, I may only need 1 tablet a day. I don't think doxy is a good example, but if I have an antibiotic that I only have to take 1 a day, the clearance rate must be slower because it's staying in my system twice as long or 3 times as long to do its job. So knowing the clearance of a substance allows you to determine how much of any kind of a medicine a person needs to take. And we're going to calculate clearance. It's really, really easy. The way you calculate the clearance is you take a blood sample and you find out the concentration in your blood. You take a pee sample and find out how much the concentration is there in their pee. And you see how much pee they made. And then you know how much came out. And clearance is actually defined as how much blood was cleared of that substance in a minute or in an hour. Clearance rate is often per hour. It may be per minute. It doesn't matter because on a test I won't give you multiple different units. All you have to do is determine the the concentration, the clearance of this substance, Z, is equal to how much of that was secreted divided by how much was in the plasma in the first place. And you find out how much was secreted by multiplying the concentration of that in the urine times how much urine you made. So here's the urine concentration of Z, and here's your volume of urine you put out, 5 milliliters, whatever, per minute, or 50 milliliters per hour, whatever it is, divided by the concentration that you found when you took the blood sample, the plasma concentration. Now, the good way that I always remember this is the clearance of any substance is equal to UV over P, ultraviolet over parasol. A parasol is something to keep the sun off your head. Ultraviolet over parasol. The urine concentration, the urine volume divided by the plasma concentration. I'll give you these three numbers. All you have to do is put the U and the V and multiply those and then divide by P, and you get your right number, the clearance rate. We'll do some practice problems on that. In the next lecture. The transport maximum is an important concept regarding clearance or regarding reabsorption. Now, if you have a substance that is filtered out and can just reabsorb at its own pace, lipids. Lipids reabsorb real easy because they can cross cell membranes. But otherwise, you have to have transporters of some kind. Glucose, for instance. You filter it, but now we have to pump it back into the blood, and it doesn't cross cell membranes easily, so we're going to need glucose transporters. That's fine. We have a ton of them. We have plenty to completely reabsorb the glucose under normal conditions, so you don't pee any out. All of it stays in your blood. But if you're diabetic and the plasma glucose is so high that the concentrations in that initial pee are too high, you overwhelm your transporters. You exceed the transport maximum allowed by those transporters. They will still reabsorb all of it they can, but the rest of it is going to show up in your pee, and you will know that you have diabetes. So here we go. Look, we have glucose clearance in a normal nephron. You filter their glucose along with your initial plasma, but you reabsorb all of it. All of your glucose stays in the blood. 0 gets peed out. There is no excretion of glucose. But with somebody who has diabetes, you filter it, you reabsorb as much as you can, but you can't reabsorb all of it, so some of it winds up in your pee. If you ever see some glucose in your pee, it probably indicates diabetes. The rest of it, look how much this is. You're absorbing a ton of it, but you can't absorb all of it, so some of it winds up in your urine, and it's an indication of diabetes. Normal urine, once it has been filtered, secreted into, reabsorbed, and then finally peed out, it's normally somewhat acidic, 4.5 to 8. That's a pretty big range. 8 to me would be too alkaline, The pH should be a little acidic. It helps you avoid urinary tract infections. Specific gravity means how much does it weigh compared to pure water. Pee has stuff other than water in it. It doesn't weigh very much. It's a tiny amount of weight, but your specific gravity compares the weight of urine to water, and it should be 1 point something or other. Very small amount. 1.003 is actually and this is pretty low for normal. I'd say like 1.0, 10 or something would be more likely to be normal, but somewhere between 1.01 and 1.03 is a normal specific gravity. If it's below this, you're overhydrated. You're peeing out almost pure water. If it's over this, you're dehydrated, or you are putting some other substances into your pee that's making it way too much. Osmotic concentration depends a lot on whether you've eaten recently, all that kind of thing. Water content, depending on if you're dehydrated or very well hydrated. A little over a liter a day you make. Clear, light yellow, not dark yellow, or you're probably dehydrated, or you may have some blood in your urine or something. I'm gonna do a urinalysis lab and record it. It's one that we would normally do ourselves. Everybody would get to do it, but at least you'll get to see how it looks and what happens. The odor varies. If you've had asparagus, it smells way different than if you've been eating other things. If you're dehydrated, it smells stronger. Usually it smells relatively fresh when you first pee, but very quickly it converts a lot of its components into ammonia and smells terrible the longer it sits there. And it shouldn't have any bacteria in it, or just the tiniest trace of bacteria. It should be sterile. Working with urine isn't like working with blood. It's a pretty safe substance to work with. Okay, that's our beginning. Next week we'll have 2 regular lectures, the second and third of the lectures on the urinary system, and we'll have a regular lab, which I will also record. So we aren't going to have any tests next week, thank goodness, but you'll have 2 lectures and you'll have a lab next week. Take care.